Broken down into its constituent parts, the Astor Library is now prepared for the Citronitis, or conjunction. This is the third stage of the magnum opus and can be described as, quote, the union of opposites and the integration of purified elements. Take out the funky stuff you don't want, gather up all the elements you wish to recombine, and achieve the next step of the alchemical process. What would your answer be if I asked, what is the opposite of art? Well, I would say commerce, one full of beauty, spirit, and the breath of life. The latter, the essence of base materialism, cold, calculated, and absent any trace of God. These two irreconcilable forces have now been separated, tossing out the chaff of dance, laughter, and theatrical performances to congregating the wheat of brick, books, and the upper tents. Raw energy, ready to be channeled into not one, but two libraries where the patrons are unable to check out books and anyone with common man's employment is unfit to attend due to business hours. Both the Astor Library and the New York Mercantile Library were under construction from roughly 1850 to 1854. And today, we will be following a man named Charles Loring Brace and what he was doing during that time, because he is quite the interesting fellow, and we will examine how he was preparing to ship all the little boys and girls across this great country and help establish an education system designed to forget who they are, chopping them down right from their Celtic roots. Before it was known as the Center for Fiction and moved to 15 Lafayette Avenue, Brooklyn, New York, the New York Mercantile Library, quote, functioned as a cultural center. Located in the freshly rezoned Astor Place Opera House from 1854 until 1891, when they demolished the building and replaced it with an 11-story high-rise. A pretty nice looking building, in fact, great colors, fancy windows, and a particularly hard to design parallelogram floor plan. The building was so nice, in fact, some important fellow decided to place in front of it
a black cube of Saturn.
This library deserves a dedicated rabbit hole in itself, in which we will eventually explore. But for today, I want to stay focused on what Brace was doing between the time of the Astor Place riot and his activities leading up to the incorporation of the Children's Aid Society. Finding a home in the Bible House for a short time, waiting for construction to be finished, and it would then immediately move into the second story of the New York Mercantile Library with many other quote-unquote benevolent societies. The CAS, or Children's Aid Society, would remain at this location for many years to come, with Charles Loring Brace as the secretary, until he would retire, though his connection to the Opera House in New York City in general wouldn't begin there. Brace would graduate from prestigious Yale University in 1846 and ostensibly planned to continue to study in theology, making the move to New York City to attend the recently incorporated Union Theological Seminary, and presumably to be near his closest comrade, John Hull Olmsted. John Olmsted and Brace grew up together in Hartford, Connecticut, and also graduated from Yale within 1 year of each other. After graduation, Olmsted's father would loan John $12,000 to purchase a 130-acre lot near Sanguine Point overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. This was a move he believed to be his true calling, but in fact, he was never good at working the soil and probably never even turned a profit the entire time he was working the farm. These circumstances never discouraged him from trying for his untimely death, though. And the farm made it easy for all three men, Charles, John, and his brother Frederick, to maintain a relationship over the years. All three of these men graduated from Yale University within 1 year of each other, and both Charles Loring Brace and Frederick Law Olmsted would become prominent, yet somewhat forgotten figures embedded into the context of his story of the pre-Civil War 1800s. When Brace arrived in New York, his original plan was to only tolerate theological studies for a year or so. He states in a letter to Fred Kingsbury on September 30th, 1848, quote, I think I should enjoy studying in New York for a year, but not much more. The novelty must wear away then, unquote. You know, God's boring. He'd rather be the Western Union of Orphans. Taking an interest in the people of New York as soon as he stepped foot onto Manhattan Island, and it became his life's obsession. In the same letter describing how he takes in every detail of the people he passes, walking down Broadway, calling it, quote, the perfect flood of humanity, finding his ultimate exhilaration in his thoughts how he could come to help raise the fools out of their, quote, inexorable confusion. Brace and John Olmsted shared a room at the Union Theological Seminary before the farm was ready, in which they were bothered as much by their fellow theologians as they were by the relentless mosquitoes and pedestrian traffic. Claiming his fellow students as pretentious as the bugs, they had, quote, bad table manners, music teachers who complained incessantly about the musical tastes of average Americans, and snooty teachers who demonstrated their overall superiority through excessively distinct enunciations as in righteousness. And in a letter stating, quote, my boarding place has a curious mixture of theologians who are, quote unquote, brothers. Of what brotherhood, one can only speculate. Though a fellow named Anthony C. Sutton claims to know of a secret society who may not have started at Union Theological Seminary, but was very early in its history infiltrated by said society, a subject we will poke at a bit later. During this time, to keep food in his stomach, Brace taught Latin at Rutgers Institute for 4.5 hours a week at a rate of $6, a wage he found more than acceptable. He would also write articles for newspapers like the New York Daily Times and the Independent to ostensibly keep some money in his pocket, though he was never shy to share his very progressive views. Life seems to be going very well for Brace and his friends until shortly after they arrive in New York City, back-to-back tragedies strike. The first being of another Yale classmate and, quote, Hartford boy, whom had grown up with Brace and the Olmsted sons. Quote, in October, we find him plunged in grief at the death of William Cole, end quote. Taken aback by the sudden nature of this event, he writes, quote, the death of William affects me very curiously. I find it so difficult to realize it, and I am constantly calling up remembrances of him which are so peculiarly earthy. Not unpleasant memories, still most unconnected with another life, and yet not, in my mind, unsuited to the most real view of their world or of the next. It was all so sudden. I have not and cannot free myself entirely from the sadness it has cast over everything. He has gained indefinitely, but does that affect my loss? I never had anything so loosen the foundations under my feet. End quote. This quote is from a very long and heartfelt letter from Brace to Frederick Kingsbury, a very successful man Brace would engage with often. The death of his close friend obviously affected him deeply and would be the biggest tragedy in his life until just a short time later, his dearly beloved sister, Emma, would fall ill. In the spring of 1849, she had apparently been living in the Southern Union and, quote, took a serious cold which almost immediately developed into a threatening of consumption, end quote, which led her to move to her aunt's house in Litchfield, Connecticut, whom took on the responsibility of caring for her devotedly. She was also greeted by Charles upon her arrival, whom at the time had very high hopes of his sister's recovery. Those hopes would be very short-lived though, as Emma's health would begin to rapidly decline soon after the summer of 1849, and by January 1850, she had moved in with Mr. and Mrs. Asa Gray. Mr. Gray is an individual we will talk about extensively later in the timeline of All Aboard. In the 1860s, after a dinner party hosted by a man whom had been on the run for nearly 2 months for treason, they would both become huge promoters of a little book you may have heard of, On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin.
But they were also interested in eugenics. Bushes, Rockefellers, Harrimans, these types of people that were into race purification. Even if you go back to Origin of Species by Darwin, read the subtitle On the Origin of Species, or the fucking preservation of the favored races. It tells you where the institutional racism comes from. It's they, them, those who can be easily named.
But before we can go there, and before Darwin can even start writing his book, we can start to see the first artifacts of Charles Loring Brace beginning to lose his faith in God. To his father on January 18th, 1850, he writes, quote, I have no hope scarcely, and have not had for some time. I do not dare look at my own feelings. I must look at it as God's doing. I believe I can. I do, for my soul acknowledge his infinite kindness, he is kind here, end quote. Though not over the edge yet, you can see him having a very hard time working this problem out in his head and heart. Even just 2 days before Emma's death, Charles is expressing faith. Quote, "The truth is, I have a very great confidence indeed in the kindness of God towards us," end quote. And even stating how he will be able to accept the outcome shall God decide to take her. Quote, "May God help you, Emma." On February 17th, 1850, Emma would finally take her last breath in stride, stating, "At one time, she had dreaded dying very much, but that now she thought God was particularly with us at that hour. Her only wish was that God's will should be done." Charles finally received a letter from his aunt, Miss Jane Loring Gray, about the news of Emma and locked himself away for 3 days and nights, refusing any company, and in any open or public way would basically refuse to talk about his sister's passing, only talking about it in private to close friends, still praising God and keeping the faith, though beginning to take a more hardened approach to the tragic event. "I dread not to meet sorrow, only may help me to become purified by it," end quote. Al Beto. Though this does seem to be somewhat of a breaking point for Brace, leading up to his sister's death during the time of her sickness, you can see in another letter addressed to his good friend Frederick Kingsbury on June 25th, 1849, a kind of long-winded letter by Brace. You can almost feel his annoyance at even writing the letter to his friend. "I am grateful for the good I get from such as you and the rest. And yet, I sometimes think it might be better for me to be entirely separated from you all for a while." End quote. And this quote is very curious to me for reasons that will be clear soon. Quote, "I am grateful for the good I get from such as you and the rest." End quote. Who exactly is the rest that he is so grateful to receive the quote-unquote good from? And why would he think it's better to be, quote, separated from you all for a while if he was so grateful for such good? Of course, he could be talking about John and his brother, the other Frederick, Brace grew up with in Connecticut. And I would like to point out again that all four also graduated from Yale University within 1 year of each other. And to me, though, that's a strange way to talk about your friends. Well, the rest is a more impersonal term you use to describe someone outside of your innermost circle, but maybe still inside the quote, the group as a whole. Now, before we go any further, I would like to be clear, what I'm about to present as of current is speculation, but just take a ride with me and see how you feel. So in order for you to understand why I find this little quote so damn curious, and let me quickly repeat it, I am grateful for the good I get from such as you and the rest, and yet I sometimes think it might be better for me to be entirely separated from you for a while. Let me first explain to you exactly who Charles Loring Brace is writing. His name is Frederick John Kingsbury, born alive January 1st, 1823, certified dead September 30th, 1910, and is commonly referred to as Waterbury's Renaissance Man. And this is quite the apt name for such a person. This is just a short list of his achievements, and I'm assuming they didn't name more because they only paid for so many words on his obituary. Quote, in 1850, Kingsbury obtained the charter for what was to become the Waterbury Savings Bank. In 1853, he established the Citizens Bank, of which he was president for many years. Kingsbury served as president of Schofield Manufacturing Company from 1868 into the early 1900s. During those years, he helped to organize the Silas Brothers Library. These dudes were obsessed with building libraries in the 1800s. The Mattatuck Historical Society, the Waterbury Hospital, and Riverside Cemetery. And in 1876, he designed the City of Waterbury seal. In addition, Kingsbury served as president of the American Social Sciences Association, founded by the host of our aforementioned dinner, Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, was a member of the Corporation of Yale University from 1887 to 1899, and earned law degrees from Yale and Williams College. End quote. Oh, you don't say. He's got a law degree from Yale University. I wonder when he graduated. Let me check. Oh, 1845. That's interesting. When did Charles Loring Brace graduate from Yale again? 1846. Isn't that interesting? To me anyways. I find it interesting because when a lot of people who align with my way of thinking think of Yale University, the first thing that comes to mind isn't the big, beautiful campus or the curriculum or what kind of money you have to get into a place like that. Not only because they are completely irrelevant details to anyone not part of the parasite bloodline family, but also because the first thing that comes to mind is something you may have heard of, called the Order of the Skull and Bones, founded in 1832, otherwise known as the Russell Trust Association, a tax-exempt foundation which handles all the public business of the Skull and Bones, incorporated in 1856 by none other than William Huntington Russell as president and Daniel Coit Gilman as treasurer. Now, we will get much more in depth to Skull and Bones and the Russell Trust Association many times on the journey of All Aboard. But for today, I want to lay down a little context for Brace's quote because Renaissance men such as Frederick John Kingsbury are exactly what these quote-unquote senior societies are looking for when they recruit new meat. I don't have definitive proof that either Kingsbury or Brace are actually members of Skull and Bones yet, but I think I can make a pretty good case for it. On Wikimedia, it is claimed that all the members' roles were kept public until around the 1970s, but I have my doubts. So does the foremost authority on the subject of Skull and Bones, Anthony C. Sutton. This excerpt from his memorandum, How the Order Controls Education, quote, "The Order, so far as its members are concerned, is designed to be secret, and apart from one or two inconsequential slips, meaningless unless one has the whole picture," end quote. At its very essence, is meant to be secret, hence secret society. When John Kerry was asked what it meant that him and George W. Bush were both bonesmen running against each other in a presidential election, his response was,
Not much, because it's a secret.
So did they really just put all of their members out there on Front Street for the general public to observe and scrutinize?
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society.
It's so secret we can't talk about it.
What does that mean for America?
No, probably not. But we'll probably never know for sure either. What we can do, though, is draw from the context clues we find in our research and follow the evidence no matter where it leads. Like this spicy little piece from the, quote, notable members section of the Wikimedia Skull and Bones page. Quote, like other senior societies, Skull and Bones membership was almost exclusively limited to white Protestant men for much of its history, end quote. What religion did Charles Loring Brace claim? Christian Protestantism. But wait, there's more. Just a short time earlier, we find in a letter written from Brace to his father in a response to a letter where his father apparently found him rather, quote-unquote, foolhardily, Brace responds in a typical father-son exchange. Son, you're being an idiot. Dad, don't worry, I'm invincible. I had the same conversation with my father. Though, with a little extra context added, we may find his response to Dad a little more intriguing. Quote, it isn't so much from a reckless desire of exposing myself that I am apt to act so, as from a want of feeling that there are dangers I have to use my reason almost always. To convince me I ought to flee from danger. I am not naturally susceptible to fear. Now that night, I did not once think of danger from the riot. However, I shall not risk my life ever for mere bravado. You may be assured, end quote. Now what exactly is Charles Loring Brace talking about here? This quote is from a short addendum he attached to his father from April 11th, 1849. At this time, Brace is studying at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and I feel like we've talked about a riot on this show around this time. Maybe a little after April, more like May. Oh yeah, May 10, 1849. That was the date of the Astor Place riot. Well, Mr. Brace. You just seem to find yourself in some very interesting places at some very interesting times. Now, I don't know his extent in the riot. It doesn't seem like he was involved in any way. I can't seem to track down the letter where his father is calling him foolhardy. But it seems like he was there in more of a spectator capacity, you know, probably just gonna catch a play down at the old Astor Place Opera House when, wouldn't you know it, Ned Buntline is there with the boys ready to wreck shop. Now, any normal person would immediately turn tail, go home at the first sign of trouble, especially a fresh Yale graduate currently attending the Union Theological Seminary to further his theological studies, his whole life ahead of him, with nothing but goals of helping the poor and needy. Surely he wouldn't stick around just for the sake of sticking around. Though it may be easy to stay calm in a situation and observe it so closely if one had prior knowledge of the event. I'm not saying he did.
Just asking questions.
But intense observation rather than retreat is a surely curious response to bullets and brick being thrown about, especially with the added context that the letter from Frederick John Kingsbury with the quote, "Sometimes I think it may be better for me to be entirely separate from you all for a while," is dated June 25th, 1849, just 1 month after the Astor Place riot. Now, you'll discover on this journey that Charles Loring Brace has a very interesting habit of finding himself in very high places at the exactly wrong time. Or right time, depending on which side of the fence you stand on. Unfortunately, though, that's all we have time for today. Please join me next time as we continue to explore the life of Charles Loring Brace. Picking up immediately after the time of his sister Emma's untimely passing, it is suggested to Brace that he and his chaps take a walk across Europe to clear their heads and get some life experience before the next chapter of their lives. And they do just that, exploring places like Ireland, England, Hungary, and Brace took a particular interest in Germany's education and upper class, a fact that would become very relevant as we continue to flow down this river. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate your support and hope you join us next time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff so you can help spread the show. And never forget to seek truth and honor the Creator above all, and let that be the whole of the law.
That's the important thing here, is that everyone's word should be meant for a use.
And the words that I'm using today are meant to pull down idols within people's temples.
Meaning that I want to destroy
Falsities that they have idolized.
for their entire life.
And just pull those out and sweep them clean. And before that temple,
And get reinfested with a new lie. Give it true life.